they're hopeful that people will take that mindset that we brought into, the people of the state of California will take that mindset they brought into the last drought and extend that forward with a 15% voluntary reduction.
In July 2021, California Governor Gavin Newsom asked people and businesses to voluntarily cut their water use by 15% as the western U.S. was going through a devastating drought. This wasn't an order, but it really showed the scale of the problem, which was only getting worse. Back then, reservoirs across the state had dropped to dangerously low levels, and some other counties had already put mandatory water restrictions in place by that time. In some areas, they even declared a state of emergency. The situation was really serious. And the next year wasn't much better. Scientists found out that the extreme drought in the western U.S., which had been going on since 2000, turned out to be the driest 22-year stretch in the last 1,200 years. But the craziest part is that water usage restrictions were being introduced at the same time as floods were hitting. Since late 2022 until mid-January 2023, it rained almost every day across California. This was caused by a string of atmospheric rivers, streams of water vapor forming along the coast. Naturally, the rains brought on major flooding, landslides, and powerful winds. At least 20 people lost their lives during these storms. These rains eased California's water shortage a bit, but they weren't enough. The drought has dragged on for far too long. Even after those massive downpours, about half the state is still dealing with extreme drought. And that naturally raises the question, is there some way to store more water during rainy periods to use later when it's dry? Turns out there is, but it's a real headache. You can't make sense of it without a coffee. Just an unobtrusive reminder to do something. And thanks to those who get, you know what. To start with, how could drought happen alongside floods in the first place? Over the past 25 years, all 58 counties in California have experienced at least one major flood, leading to loss of life and causing damages worth billions of dollars. Just look at the list of recent floods and you'll see that California's been dealing with too much water pretty much all the time. 2022, 2023, 2024, all these years were marked by heavy rains with the atmospheric rivers I've already mentioned turning the land into a soaked mess. Floods have happened before, though. For example, in January 2017, a flood hit Northern California pretty hard. It was the rainiest winter in almost a century. The rains even broke the record set in 1982-1983. But I won't go into details of all the floods in California, or else we'd be stuck on them for the whole day and never get to the point. The main thing to understand is this: water is coming into the state, and in large amounts, regularly. This makes you wonder why there's the drought and water shortages. So what's the deal here? Well, the logic is simple. Yes, in California, there are times when there's a whole lot of water, but once that water falls from the sky, it just flows into the ocean. People don't gather or use it to the fullest. The state, like most of the western U.S., relies on the snow cover every winter. It's what replenishes the surface water streams and lakes. And most of the water from the numerous rains flows back into the Pacific Ocean without any obstacles. It's all because the infrastructure that helps California store and manage water, like large reservoirs, is too clunky, I guess. It's practically unable to handle the intense and rapidly changing weather, and the weather keeps changing more often and more severely due to climate change. Though you can't say California hasn't made an effort to fix the problem, since this is an issue that affects more than just the state itself. The U.S. is heavily reliant on California when it comes to food. California's farms produce billions of dollars worth of goods every year, more than farms in Texas, Nebraska, and other farming-heavy states, even though those states focus more on agriculture. The water in California supports jobs and livelihoods all across the state, and California's economy is stronger than that of most countries in the world. However, no other state experiences such drastic changes in rainfall throughout the year, constantly swinging between floods and droughts. Given how many people, plants, and animals rely on water, it's water battles that have been shaping California since its foundation. The largest state-run water and power supply system in the country is located right here. It's called the State Water Project, or SWP. The SWP consists of 700 miles of aqueducts, 5 power plants, and 24 pump stations. It delivers water to 29 urban and agricultural water suppliers in California, providing water to over 25 million residents and irrigating 750,000 acres of farmland. This supports about 2/3 of California's entire economy. Naturally, all this water needs to be stored somewhere, and the SWP has 34 reservoirs and lakes for this purpose. For example, Lake Oroville is a reservoir formed by the Oroville Dam and the Feather River. It's located in Butte County, and it's the second largest reservoir in California. For the SWP, Oroville is a key asset. It not only stores water and helps control flooding, but also serves as a recreational spot and is used to protect fish and wildlife. Construction of the dam on the Feather River began back in 1957, and it came in handy right away. A few years later, in December 1964, the partially finished dam stopped a flood. That saved the Sacramento Valley from flooding. Another example is San Luis Reservoir, an artificial lake on the San Luis Creek located on the eastern slope of the Diablo Range in Merced County. It stores water taken from the delta of the San Joaquin-Sacramento River. Water is pumped uphill into the reservoir from O'Neill Forebay, which is fed by the California Aqueduct and is released back when needed, for example, for irrigation of farms and other purposes. What am I getting at? SWP is a huge and really important thing. Without it, California would have never gotten the economic power it has today. Creating the project took decades and a lot of political and engineering effort. In fact, something similar was attempted in California before. Proposals like that date back to the 1880s. But back then, the project didn't get any political or financial support, and that remained the case until the late 1950s. Even then, the project still faced serious engineering challenges, like lifting water over the Tehachapi Mountains. This, by the way, is quite an interesting story. In solving the water problem, California managed to build the highest water pump in the world. It's called the Edmonston Pumping Plant, and it's considered the main feature of the SWP. The station lifts water by 2,000 feet across the Tehachapi Mountains, where it splits into the western and eastern branches of the California Aqueduct, which serves Southern California. To give you an idea, 2,000 feet's roughly 200 stories. And to make all of this work, the station uses 14 four-stage centrifugal pumps, each with 80,000 horsepower, and these pumps stretch down across 6 floors. Basically, it's an incredibly impressive setup that also uses a lot of power. To be more specific, the station consumes 40% of all the electricity used by SWP. But no matter how cool the project is, it stopped doing its job. Of course, there are reasons for that. First of all, the system has become outdated. Some of the biggest and most important parts of the SWP were built almost 100 years ago. For example, the Colorado Aqueduct, which pumps water from the Colorado River to Southern California, was built in the 1930s and is about to celebrate its 100th birthday. No wonder that damage is happening more and more often. A significant part of California's vast water infrastructure, like aqueducts, reservoirs, and dams, was built with the hydrology of the 20th century in mind. They simply weren't designed for today's more intense droughts and heavy rains. The system just can't handle our modern world. Second of all, the system simply wasn't designed to handle the number of people living in California today. In the late 1970s, when the state went through a major drought, fewer than 20 million people lived there. Now that number has doubled, and with the population increase, so has the number of water users. And finally, the third reason is that SWP was never fully completed. Initially, the project was supposed to become a much bigger system, but in the end, only the first phase of construction was finished. The second one was supposed to be launched in the late 1970s and 1980s, but due to strong opposition from residents of Northern California, environmental groups, some economic interests, and the growing state debt, it never happened. Wait, what do environmentalists have to do with this? I was surprised too. But it turns out that in dry years, the water being pumped out of the delta creates a danger for salmon. The pump station messes with the normal flow from east to west, which is the route the young salmon follow to the Pacific Ocean. The effect is so severe that salmon populations have hit critically low numbers, and they've been shrinking ever since the SWP started pumping the water. Salmon in California has a ton of problems, surprisingly. Did you know that the fish are competing for fresh water with fields? I didn't, but it turns out this competition is real. Increasing water temperatures in rivers also cause major damage, wiping out salmon eggs. This happens when dam operators release cold water from reservoirs for industrial farming or Southern California cities at the wrong time of year. On top of that, the construction of dams has deprived salmon of 80 to 90% of their traditional spawning spots. And don't forget about human activities like straightening rivers, reinforcing shores, and building embankments, mainly to create farmland. All of this has denied baby salmon access to the shores, side channels, and floodplains where they historically found rich feeding grounds and safe havens from predators. But even if the fish manage to cope with this, the huge water intake pipes suck up an immeasurable amount of fry. They end up on the fields as part of the irrigation water and maybe in some way help plants grow, but it doesn't make it any easier for the fish. The problems with salmon directly affect people because California's salmon industry is worth $1.4 billion and provides 23,000 jobs. California should be invested in the health of the salmon. Anyway, fish are a whole different issue. Right now, California really needs some practical solutions to ensure a steady water supply. The climate is changing, and it looks like the only thing that can be done is to build more reservoirs and not waste any precious water. This is where the Sites Reservoir comes into play. It's a unique project designed to collect and store water from big storms. Later on, they plan to use this water to supply people, farms, and the environment of California during dry spells. The Sites Reservoir will be located on the west side of the Sacramento Valley, not far from Maxwell, a small farming town in Colusa County, about 65 miles northwest of Sacramento. You know, sometimes there's a project that people aren't too keen on, but this one has the full backing from almost everyone. Local leaders, the public, water resource officials, and even environmentalists. Well, at least they haven't spoken out against it yet. Anyway, the new reservoir will have several differences from the ones we already have, mainly its size. It's projected at 65 billion cubic feet, and that's on purpose. Climate predictions show that more rainfall is expected rather than snow, but the current system for managing water resources lacks the infrastructure to make the most out of the rain. On the other hand, the Sites Reservoir will capture water from extreme storms and send it to the right places when droughts hit. And yes, after it's up and running, the Sites Reservoir will also be integrated into the SWP. But first, the sites need to be built. The plan is for the reservoir to stretch 13 miles from north to south and 4 miles from east to west. When full, the reservoir will have a depth of about 262 feet from the surface to the bottom at its lowest point. The capacity of the sites must be enough to supply water to 7.5 million people throughout the year. In short, it's just a huge reservoir that's set to become the 8th largest in California. Two main dams, Sites Dam and Golden Gate Dam, will be built to hold water in a reservoir where the hills dip too low, but they won't block the main waterways or rivers. I can already hear the salmon giving their approval, even if they don't spawn there. Sites will also include 9 small dams to keep the water at the right level. Yep, you got it right. This time they didn't just put a dam in a random spot to block the river and create a reservoir. Now they've specifically chosen a valley off the main water paths, and the dams are essentially being used to close up holes in the mountains to prevent the reservoir from leaking where it shouldn't. Now all that's left is to finish building it and fill it up. Water for the Sites Reservoir will come from 2 main sources, the Sacramento River and local streams. Water from the Sacramento River is diverted to the existing Red Bluff pump station, which is equipped with modern fish protection screens. Salmon continues to approve the project. Although there's a 14-mile gap between the reservoir and the river, pipes and canals are already in place and water will be pumped through them. They plan to pump just around 4% of the Sacramento River water, which would otherwise run into the ocean, into the reservoir. The environment won't be affected. It's actually a shame that they're only starting work on the Sites Reservoir now. If it had already existed and been up and running, it could have been completely filled with water from the last 2 really wet winters. This water would be available for future dry years and everyone would be really happy. And unlike the reservoirs of the past, sites won't block any major river systems or pose a threat to fish migration or spawning. Sites will be the first reservoir in California where part of the water will be directed specifically for environmental needs to support wildlife and their habits during drought periods. It'll even regulate the salinity of water in the delta, help keep cold water for salmon, and overall improve living conditions. What about the energy costs? After all, pumping water this far from the river isn't easy, but the creators of Sites thought of that too. Sites will work like a large regulating reservoir, storing both water and electricity during times of surplus, so both resources can be used when needed. That is, the reservoir will be used to pump water in during winter when energy demand is low. Then in summer, the water will be released from the reservoir for irrigation and environmental purposes, while also generating power. Convenient. When the water's released, it'll produce so much electricity that it can give back 70 to 80% of what was used to fill the reservoir. And it goes in a loop like that. Basically, the energy costs are really low. What about the timeline? Well, they plan to start construction in 2026, and they expect the reservoir to be operational by the end of 2032. The project cost $3.9 billion, but that's not too much considering the expected economic benefits about $260 million per year, and the operating costs are $10 to $20 million. So the reservoir will pay for itself in about 16 years. Water restriction. To improve the water situation, California decided to introduce long-term restrictions on water use this summer for the first time. The state will require the largest water supply company serving 95% of residents to reduce the amount of water supplied over the next 15 years. The restrictions are pretty serious. The companies will have to reduce the amount of water they provide to residents by up to 40% according to established consumption norms. To achieve the necessary cuts, suppliers might raise prices. The plan is to encourage savings or promote the use of water-saving appliances. Actually, it's not surprising given all the droughts they've had over the past few years and the expected 10% water shortage by 2040. That's why urgent measures are being taken, and the new water reduction order will go into effect starting January 1st, 2025. Will the residents be happy about it? Probably not, but there's no other solution for now. They still have a lot of work to do building the new reservoir. Unexpected fines. To give you an idea of how serious California's water issues are, the Water Resources Association has notified the authorities about plans to introduce fines for water use. Local farmers and ranchers will no longer be able to take water from the Shasta River, and this is the first restriction in the past 100 years. It all started when the people living in the Shasta River Valley came together and wrote a letter expressing concern about the critically low water levels, as well as the health of both the population and the animals. The lack of water is causing the livestock feed to dry up, forcing farmers to sell their animals because they can't provide proper conditions for them. And if you're wondering where all the water went, here's the answer. The Shasta River is extremely important to the native tribes of California, who have depended on it for thousands of years. On top of that, the river remains a key part of the local agricultural sector, as it's always been used for irrigation. The drought made things worse, and now the river's condition is far from perfect. What's the deal with the fines? At first, farmers who used too much river water were fined only $500 a day, but the farmers ignored the ban and ran the pumps for an entire week, and you can get why. The wells ran dry and the small ponds dried up. Where else are they supposed to get the water? In response to such a blatant violation, penalties have been toughened, and now, if the allowed water extraction limit is exceeded, fines can go up to $10,000 per day, plus an additional $2,500 for every acre-foot of water taken. If the new penalties were applied to this situation, farmers could face fines over $1.2 million. It sounds ridiculous, I agree. But the situation is already on the brink of disaster. Potable wastewater. Let me ask you an unpleasant question. Would you drink wastewater? Most people would probably answer no, because first, it's gross, and second, it's simply dangerous. But in California, it's a different story. With the drought worsening, Los Angeles is kicking off a $740 million project to turn wastewater into drinking water in the San Fernando Valley. The new treatment plant is expected to produce up to 20 million gallons of purified water daily, serving around 250,000 people. The plant will send purified water 10 miles to the northeast of Los Angeles County to what's called distribution basins. Here, the water will go into special containers where it'll naturally filter itself and be sent to underground aquifers for further storage. When needed, the city will be able to take water from the wells. After that, it'll go through additional checks and cleaning stages before being sent through pipes to eventually reach the water supply systems for homes and businesses. Overall, everyone will benefit from this project. Well, except for the budget. The project's expected to be completed by 2027, and by 2035, the authorities in Los Angeles plan to treat all wastewater and use it for the needs of the population. The threat of lawns. It might sound surprising to some, but experts say one of the reasons for the water crisis is grassy lawns. Studies show that maintaining lawns in front of homes uses up to 75% of all the water a household consumes. In times of drought, made worse by climate change, this luxury is no longer affordable for California. That's why new restrictions are being introduced. Now you have to reduce lawn watering to just once a week. The trend of lawns in the U.S. actually dates back to 17th century England. Back then, well-maintained lawns were a sign of luxury and high social status due to the high cost of maintaining them. Over time, lawns required more resources, but the U.S. just couldn't give them up because they looked nice. There were so many lawns that NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found that grass covers more land than any crop, including corn and wheat. By the early 2000s, the area covered by lawn grasses, mostly in front of houses, exceeded 63,000 square miles, larger than the entire state of Georgia. Because of the current situation in the state, traditional lawns are no longer right for Southern California. According to researchers, a small patch for kids to play or simply hang out's okay, but large lawns that are just appreciated for their looks should become a thing of the past. Salmon is banned. Poor California salmon. It recently turned out that they're also at risk due to the drought, which led to a ban on both commercial and recreational fishing of this species in California's coastal waters. This decision has been made for the second year in a row, and for the second year in a row, fishermen are very upset about the restrictions. Because of the drought and the rerouting of water, the rivers have become too warm and slow for the salmon to develop properly. A representative from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife noted that the salmon population forecasts are so low that the fish need time to recover, which is why they've banned fishing. And although this is good news for the salmon, the fishing ban is going to hit California restaurants and buyers hard. They'll have to find salmon elsewhere. Honestly, it's a blow to an entire industry that used to generate $500 million annually. Fishermen say they'll now have to do something they don't enjoy. Imagine being forced to mop the floor instead of streaming from a comfy chair. Annoying? Yes, it is. That's exactly how the fishermen feel. You owe me something. See you later.